Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I come to the floor to recognize a solemn occasion. In 2 days on Friday, April 20th, it'll be the 2-year anniversary of the Deepwater Horizon explosion. And I wanted to pause at this moment of anniversary, 2 years, and offer a few thoughts about what was clearly a very significant episode and challenge for our whole country, but particularly for my state of Louisiana and for the Gulf Coast. First of all, I want to start where I think we should always start in discussing and considering this event, and that is the loss of 11 lives. 11 men were killed in that explosion. And again, we need to pause, reflect, pray, and offer prayerful support to them and their families. Those 11 victims were Donald Clark, Stephen Curtis, Arundel Burkeen, Adam Weiss, Roy Kemp, Jason Anderson, Gordon Jones, Blair Manuel, Dewey Rivette, Carl Dale Clevenger Jr., and Shane Roshto. And I ask here on the Senate floor, I ask unanimous consent that we pause just for a few seconds in silent, prayerful thought and consideration of those 11 men and their families.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. The tragedy, of course, started there with those 11 lives lost, and we must never forget that, including as we redouble our efforts to ensure safety in those sorts of drilling environments in the future. Madam President, of course, the second big impact was on the environment, particularly the Gulf environment where I live in Louisiana. 4.9 million barrels of oil were discharged during the spill. That was about 50,000 barrels a day, every day, for 3 months. 320 miles of Louisiana coastline were oiled. That was a little over half of the total coastline on the Gulf that was oiled, 600 miles. Over 86,000 square miles of waters were closed to fishing. About 36% of federal waters in the Gulf were closed. Now, we did that on a very aggressive, proactive basis to make sure we avoided any contaminated seafood ever reaching a store shelf, ever reaching a restaurant. And the good news is we accomplished that. Through that proactive closing, not a single piece of contaminated seafood ever reached a store shelf or ever reached a restaurant customer. And that was quite an accomplishment. Lots of dead animals were collected, 6,800, 6,100 birds, and also other sea turtles and dolphins. And so it was a huge, the biggest ever in U.S. history, environmental disaster. Now, 2 years later, as we pause and look at the environmental effect of that, I think, quite frankly, there's good news and bad news, or at least good news and continuing challenges. The good news is I don't think anyone would have predicted that the Gulf would rebound back to where it is today. And Mother Nature has proved, again, to be amazingly resilient, and that really is good news. At the time, there are all sorts of pretty dire predictions of huge dead zones covering half the Gulf, and that has certainly not materialized. So Mother Nature has proved amazingly resilient. But I don't want to trivialize continuing challenges, continuing work, and there is continuing environmental work. And I would underscore 2 projects that are ongoing that are very, very important. First is the NRDA process under federal law, the Natural Resource Damage Assessment. That is the process under federal law by which all stakeholders help assess the damage to the environment so that the folks guilty of this horrendous incident pay for those damages, pay the state, pay the federal government, pay others who will work to restore the environment. That NERDA process is ongoing. It's a multi-year process, but there is some positive result from that process already. Step one of the process was a settlement with BP for an upfront payment of about $1 billion. And just today, 2 specific projects in Louisiana were announced as a direct result of that first, not last, but first upfront payment of $1 billion. There's a Lake Hermitage Marsh Creation Project in Plaquemines Parish. That'll create approximately 104 acres of brackish marsh from the beneficial use of dredge material. That's being announced today. And the Louisiana Oyster Culch Project. That consists of the placement of oyster culch into about 850 acres of public oyster seed grounds throughout coastal Louisiana. So those projects are the start of that NERDA process coming to fruition. And then the second important work that's ongoing that involves all of us here in the Senate directly is the need to pass the Restore Act through the Highway Reauthorization Bill, the Transportation Reauthorization Bill. The Restore Act language would dedicate 80% of the Clean Water Act funds related to this disaster to Gulf Coast restoration. I thank all my colleagues again for an enormously positive, really overwhelmingly positive bipartisan vote to attach that Restore Act language to the Senate Highway Bill. And I urge my House colleagues, including House conservatives, to pass a House version of the Highway Bill today. That's important for our country, for highway infrastructure, and it's important because it's a vehicle for this Restore Act. Now, a third and final category, Madam President, that I wanted to touch on that isn't as positive, quite frankly, as the environmental rebound is the impact of all of this and the related moratorium on drilling to our economy on the Gulf Coast and energy production. Immediately after the disaster, very soon thereafter, President Obama announced a complete moratorium on activity in the Gulf, on new drilling. And that moratorium lasted several months. I think that was a bad mistake, an overreaction to the disaster. And I think that's been borne out in several ways, including that the panel of experts that the president got together, their report, we now know, was actually doctored and edited at the White House to make it seem like those true experts supported a full moratorium when we know directly from them that they did not. Well, this moratorium went in place anyway, and it created a lot of additional economic harm and hurt to a lot of Gulf Coast residents and workers that was unnecessary. Now, of course, we needed to pause and get new procedures and some new safety regulations in place. Of course, we need to learn the lessons of the disaster, incorporate those into practices. But we didn't need an all-out moratorium for months, and we don't need a continuing slowdown that continues to this day. An analogy I've often used is when we have an airplane crash, a horrible disaster. We do not ground every plane after such an incident for months. We allow the industry and that important travel and commercial activity to continue as we immediately learn the lessons of the disaster and incorporate it into safety proceedings. Well, unfortunately, my point of view did not hold sway at the White House. We had this moratorium. The complete formal moratorium lasted until into October 2010. But when that formal complete moratorium was lifted, it didn't just end there. For months and months after that, we had a de facto moratorium, permits which weren't happening, only a trickle of permits. And now, even though permitting has increased somewhat, we have a dramatic permit slowdown and a slowdown of activity in the Gulf. Now more than ever, our country and our citizens can't afford that. The price at the pump is about $4 a gallon. It's doubled, more than doubled, during President Obama's tenure. And we cannot afford this avoidable slowdown and decrease in important domestic energy activity. Again, a lot of folks around the country don't realize it, but permitting in the Gulf is still way below pre-BP levels. It's 40% below pre-BP levels. Now, again, we need to learn, and we have, the lessons of the BP disaster. We need to incorporate those into our regulatory policy, and we have. But we can't afford a permit slowdown of more than 40% since before the BP disaster. Because of that, and because of other factors, energy production is down. On federal property, all oil production is down about 14% in the last year. Federal offshore production is down about 17%. And so, again, that's some of the most lasting negative impact, economic impact from the disaster, the Obama administration's wrong-headed reaction to it and lingering negative policy on domestic energy production, which we can't afford as the Gulf region, which we can't afford as a country, which we can afford less than ever now with the price at the pump. So again, I hope we do learn the lessons of this disaster. I hope we continue to ensure that those safety and other lessons are built in to our regulatory framework and best practices in industry. I think that's largely been done, and that work continues. But I also hope we honor the life work of those 11 men who lost their lives, who worked hard every day in that industry, producing good American energy, by not only allowing that work to happen safely, ensuring that happens safely, but allowing that work to happen, allowing American citizens to benefit from that work. The United States is the single most energy-rich country in the world, bar none, far richer, for instance, than any Middle Eastern country like Saudi Arabia. The problem is we're the only country in the world that puts well over 90% of those domestic resources off limits and says, no, 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 you can't do this, no, you can't touch that. We need to build a common sense American energy policy that says yes, 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 we can do it safely, and yes, we can provide American energy for American families and the American economy. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.